Story begins. The old man could open any lock in the world, and the FBI had spent more than 40 years pretending he had died in a fire that never happened. His name was Walter Henning, or at least that was the name stenciled on the front window of the small shop on Delano Street, and everyone in the little Tennessee town of Marrow Creek knew him as the locksmith who never raised his voice and never forgot a face. He was 81 years old. His hands trembled when he held a coffee cup, but they went perfectly still the moment they touched a lock. People noticed that. They just never understood what it meant, and the young man who would eventually understand it, who would dig until the truth came up out of the ground like something that had been buried alive, hadn't even started his apprenticeship yet on the morning this story really begins. But that wasn't where the danger started. The danger started with a box. Marrow Creek sat in a fold of the eastern Tennessee hills, the kind of town where the same 40 families had lived for 4 generations, and a stranger's car got noticed before it finished parking. The locksmith shop had been there longer than most people could remember. Cream-colored brick, a hand-painted sign that read, "Henning Lock and Key." The gold lettering faded to the color of weak tea. Inside, the air smelled of brass shavings, machine oil, and the faint metallic sweetness of cut keys. Hundreds of blanks hung on the walls in neat rows, catching the light like fish scales. A bell over the door announced every customer with the same tired chime. Walter opened at 7 every morning. He made his coffee black in a percolator that predated the moon landing. He swept the floor in long, straight strokes, never circular, and if anyone had asked him why, he would have smiled and said his old teacher told him circles left dust in the corners. He never said who the teacher was. He never said much about anything before 1979, and after 46 years in town, people had simply stopped asking. That was the thing about Walter Henning. His silence was so gentle, so complete, that you forgot it was a wall. The young man's name was Eli Brandt. He was 23, lean and restless, with the kind of nervous intelligence that had gotten him fired from 3 jobs and admired by none of his bosses. He'd come back to Marrow Creek after dropping out of an engineering program 2 states away, broke and embarrassed, and his mother had pushed him toward the locksmith because Walter was looking for help, and Eli was good with his hands, and even better with the questions nobody wanted answered. Eli took the job because he needed money. He stayed because of the old man's hands. He'd watched Walter open a customer's antique gun safe one afternoon, a safe the customer had inherited and lost the combination to. And the old man hadn't drilled it, hadn't forced it, hadn't even seemed to work hard. He'd simply pressed his fingertips to the dial, closed his eyes, and turned it with an attention so total it looked like prayer. 40 seconds. The bolt slid back with a heavy, satisfied thunk. The customer laughed in disbelief. Eli didn't laugh. He just stared at the old man's hands and felt the first cold prickle of a question he didn't have words for yet. "How did you do that?" Eli asked, after the customer left. Walter wiped his hands on a rag. "Patience," he said. "Most locks just want to be listened to." "That's not an answer." The old man looked at him then, and for half a second something moved behind his pale gray eyes, something old and careful and tired. Then it was gone. "No," Walter agreed quietly. "It isn't." And he went back to sweeping. That was the first crack. Eli didn't know it yet. The weeks that followed taught Eli a great deal, and almost nothing at the same time. The old man was a patient teacher, generous with the trade and miserly with himself. He taught Eli how to read the cut of a key, how to feel the pins lift under a pick, how a good lock and a bad lock spoke in different voices. But whenever the conversation drifted toward the past, Walter folded it up like a finished newspaper and set it aside. Where was he from? Up north, mostly. Did he have family? Once. Had he always been a locksmith? At that question, the old man's hands went still over the workbench, just for a moment, and he said, "I've always opened things," in a voice that made the hair on Eli's arms stand up. There was the night, too, that Eli would only understand much later. A storm had knocked out the power on Delano Street, and Eli had stayed late helping Walter finish a job by lamplight. When the lights died, the shop went black. And in that sudden dark, Eli heard the old man move. Not the shuffle of an 81-year-old. Something else. A single fluid step, soundless. And then Walter's voice came from a completely different part of the room than where he'd been sitting, calm and low. "Don't move until I find the lamp." Eli hadn't heard him cross the floor. He hadn't heard a chair scrape or a footfall. The old man had simply relocated in the dark, like water finding a lower place. And when the lamp flared to life, Walter was standing between Eli and the front door, his body angled toward it without seeming to be. And for one strange second, the locksmith's eyes weren't tired at all. Then he smiled and handed Eli the lamp and said the storm always made his knees ache, and the moment folded itself away, and Eli told himself he'd imagined it. He was good at telling himself things. He would not be good at it for much longer. There were details that didn't add up, and Eli, being the kind of person who couldn't leave a loose thread alone, began to collect them. The way Walter sat with his back to the wall, always, never the door. The way he tracked the bell over the door, even when his hands were buried in a job. His eyes flicking up at every chime with a speed that didn't belong to an 81-year-old man. The framed photograph behind the register, black and white, showing a group of men standing in front of a stone building somewhere with snow on the ground and writing on a sign that wasn't English. Walter said it was a trip he took once. He didn't say where, he didn't say when, and the men in the photo weren't smiling like people on a trip. They were standing the way soldiers stand when someone tells them to look natural and they can't quite remember how. But none of that was the thing that broke it open. The thing that broke it open arrived on a gray Tuesday in late October, wrapped in a man's overcoat and carried by a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She came in just before noon, mid-50s, expensive coat gone shabby at the cuffs, a city pallor that didn't belong in Marrow Creek. She set a bundle on the counter and unwrapped it with the careful reluctance of someone handling a thing she was a little afraid of. Inside was a box. Not a safe, not a strong box. A box about the size of a briefcase, made of a dull gray metal that drank the light instead of reflecting it. No brand, no keyhole that Eli could see. Just a seamless face of metal with a single recessed panel where a lock should have been, and a row of stamped characters along one edge that Eli, leaning in, recognized as letters and numbers, but in a sequence that made no sense. "I need this opened," the woman said. "My father passed last month. This was in his things. There's no key, no combination, nothing. 3 locksmiths in Knoxville told me they couldn't touch it. One of them gave me this address." Walter didn't move. He was standing at the workbench at the back, and Eli, who had spent 6 weeks learning to read the old man's stillness, saw something change in it. It was the kind of stillness a deer has the half-second before it runs. "Who gave you this address?" Walter asked. His voice was perfectly level. "I don't know. A man on the phone. He didn't give his name. He just said Marrow Creek, Henning, and that you'd know what to do with it." The woman's hands were shaking. "Is something wrong?" For a long moment, Walter said nothing. Eli watched the old man's eyes move over the box, over the stamped characters along the edge, and watched the color drain slowly out of his face, the way water drains out of a cracked basin. When Walter finally walked to the counter, his trembling had stopped completely. His hands were as steady as Eli had ever seen them. "Leave it," Walter said. "Come back Thursday. Can you open it?" "I can open it." He looked at her, and something in his expression made the woman take a step back. "The question is whether anyone should." She left the box. She left fast. And when the bell over the door stopped chiming, Walter Henning did something Eli had never seen him do in 6 weeks. He walked to the front door, flipped the sign to closed at 12:15 in the afternoon, and turned the deadbolt with his own key. "Go home, Eli," he said. "What is that thing?" "Go home." But Eli didn't go home, and that decision would change both of their lives. He went home, technically. He got in his truck, drove 2 blocks, parked, and walked back through the alley to the rear window of the shop, because he was 23 and incapable of leaving a locked door alone, whether the lock was made of metal or made of a man. Through the dusty glass he watched the old man sit alone at the workbench with the gray box in front of him and not touch it for almost an hour. Walter just sat there, looking at it, the way you'd look at a photograph of someone you'd buried. Then, finally, he reached into his shirt and pulled out something that hung on a chain around his neck. Something Eli had never seen, something the old man had apparently worn against his skin every single day for 46 years. It was a key, small, dull, the same light-drinking gray as the box. Walter held it in his palm and looked at it for a long time. Then he pressed it into the recessed panel where there was no visible keyhole at all, and the panel swallowed it, and the box opened with a sound like a held breath being let go. Eli couldn't see inside from the alley, but he saw the old man's face when he looked into it, and it was the face of a man looking at his own grave. The next morning Eli came to work early and found the shop already open and the box gone. Walter was at the bench grinding a key blank as though nothing had happened, and when Eli opened his mouth, the old man said, without turning around, "You came back last night." It wasn't a question. Eli's stomach dropped. "I saw the truck lights in the alley at 1 in the morning, Walter said, still grinding. "You parked behind the dry cleaner. You walked back along the fence line. You stood at the rear window for 40 minutes. He set down the key blank and turned around. "I knew you were there before you reached the corner. Do you understand what I'm telling you, son? An old man with bad knees knew you were there the moment you stepped into the alley. That should frighten you. It frightens me, because it means I'm not as rusty as I prayed I'd become." "Walter, what's in the box?" The old man studied him for a long moment, and then, perhaps because he was tired in a way that went down 46 years, perhaps because he'd known this day would come and had simply run out of road, he made a decision. He walked to the front door, flipped the sign to closed again, and said, "Sit down, and don't say a word until I'm finished, because if I stop, I won't be able to start again." Here is the story the old man told. His name had never been Walter Henning. The man who would become Walter Henning was born in 1944 in a steel town in Pennsylvania, and by the time he was 19, he could open anything that had a lock on it, a skill that began as a way to get into places a poor boy wasn't welcome, and turned, by the cold logic of the era, into a profession with no name. In 1963, 2 men in good suits came to see him in the county jail, where he was being held for breaking into a department store, and they did not talk about the department store, they talked about a future. They asked him whether he loved his country. They asked him whether he would like to do for his government what he had been doing for himself, except in places where being caught meant something a great deal worse than a county cell. He said yes. He was 19. Everyone said yes at 19. For 16 years he did not have a name that stayed the same for more than a few months. He was the man you sent into the places that officially did not exist, to open the things that officially were not there. Embassies, vaults, the sealed offices of men whose deaths would later be described in the newspapers as heart attacks. He opened diplomatic safes in cities he was never recorded as having visited. He photographed documents that changed the shape of negotiations that the public was told had failed. He was very, very good. And the thing about being very good at a thing like that is that you become valuable. And the thing about becoming valuable is that you become a problem, because a valuable man knows valuable things, and valuable things do not stay secret around men who can be captured. The box, Walter told Eli, was the last job. 1979. A program inside a program, a thing so deep that even the men who ran it used a name for it that Walter would not say aloud even now, 46 years later, sitting in a locked shop in a town nobody had heard of. There had been 6 men who could do what Walter did. By the winter of 1979, there were 2. By the spring of 1979, the official record showed that there was 1, because the other, a man Walter had trained, a man he had loved like a younger brother, had died in a warehouse fire in Baltimore, along with, conveniently, all the records of the program they had served. Except the man who died in that fire was not the man the records said it was. The man who died in that fire was Walter Henning, the real Walter Henning, a forger and a drunk, who had done some peripheral work for the program and whose teeth and dental records were close enough after a fire to pass. And the man who walked out of Baltimore that night with a new name and a dead man's identity was the one who had spent 16 years opening the doors of the world. He took the name of the corpse. He took a small gray box that he was never supposed to take, that contained the only physical proof that the program had existed at all. Names, dates, the operations, the deaths that had been written up as accidents. And he took a key, which he had cut himself in the dark from a blank, in the only 40 minutes of his life he had ever truly been alone. He buried himself in a town in the Tennessee hills, and he became a locksmith. And for 46 years, the thing he had buried himself to protect hung against his chest on a chain, and the proof of everything sat inside a box that no one alive but him could open. "Then why," Eli whispered, "did that woman bring it to you? You said it was gone. You buried it." "I did bury it," Walter said. "I gave it to a man I trusted, the only one left, and he kept it the way I kept the key. We agreed, if either of us ever brought the box to the other, it meant the past had found us, and it was time." He looked at his trembling hands. "That woman's father was my friend Eli, the last one. He died last month, and somewhere in his papers he left instructions, and they led her here to me with the box. He sent it to me from his grave. It's a message. It means they're moving again. After 46 years, someone reopened the file." "Who?" And as if the question had a key of its own, the bell over the door chimed. It shouldn't have. The door was locked. Eli had watched Walter turn the deadbolt with his own hand. But the bell chimed, and 2 men stepped inside, and the locked door swung shut behind them. And Eli understood with a cold lurch in his gut that for men like these, a deadbolt was a courtesy, not an obstacle. They were not old. That was the first thing Eli noticed. Mid-40s, fit, in the kind of plain clothes that are a uniform precisely because they're trying not to be. They moved into the shop the way water moves into a low place, without hurry, filling the room, leaving no corner unwatched. The first man smiled, pleasant and professional. The second did not smile at all. His eyes went straight to Walter and stayed there. "Mr. Henning," the first man said warmly. Or, well, we're past that, aren't we? He let the sentence hang. "Quite a town you found. We almost didn't. You did good work hiding. Better than the others." Walter rose slowly from his stool, and Eli watched something extraordinary happen to the old man. The tremble left his hands. The stoop left his shoulders. 46 years seemed to slide off him like a coat, and for one impossible moment Eli saw not the locksmith of Marrow Creek, but the man who had walked out of a burning warehouse in Baltimore with a dead man's name and a country's worst secret pressed against his heart. "You're young," Walter said. "Too young to have been there. They sent you to clean up something you don't understand." "We understand enough," the second man said. His voice was flat. "We understand there's a box. We understand you have it. And we understand it ends today, one way or another." His gaze flicked to Eli for the first time, and Eli felt it like cold water down his back. "Who's the boy?" "He's an apprentice," Walter said. "He knows nothing. He just started." "He's standing in the room," the second man said. "Now that makes him something." The first man held up a hand, still pleasant, still smiling. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're not here to make anything difficult, Mr. Henning. We're here to recover government property, the box, the key. You hand them over, and a 46-year-old loose end gets tied up quietly, and nobody in this charming little town ever knows you were anything but a locksmith. That's a generous offer, more generous than your friends got." "My friends," Walter said softly, "got warehouse fires." The smile didn't waver, but something behind it cooled. "Times have changed. We do things cleaner now." And here Walter Henning did the thing that Eli would remember for the rest of his life, the thing he would tell his own grandchildren about decades later, the thing that turned a frightened old locksmith into something close to a legend in a town that would, eventually, learn the truth. He laughed. It was a low, dry, unhurried laugh, and it was so completely without fear that both men went still. "You came here," Walter said, "to recover a box. Let me tell you about the box. The box has been opened exactly twice in 46 years. Once by me, the night I took it, and once 2 days ago when I had to be sure. And in those 46 years, do you imagine I just sat on it? Do you imagine an old man with nothing to do but cut keys and wait to die didn't make arrangements?" He took a step toward them. "I scanned every page. I copied every name. I sealed it in 7 places you will never find, with 7 people who have one instruction. If I die, if I disappear, if I so much as break a hip, the seal opens, and the whole thing goes to people who will know exactly what they're looking at. Reporters, a senator's office, the descendants of the men your predecessors burned. I am not the loose end, gentlemen. I am the dam. And you are standing in front of me threatening to knock me down without the faintest idea of what's behind me." The room was very quiet. It was a bluff, and it was not a bluff, and Eli, watching the 2 men's faces, could not tell which, and neither, he realized, could they. That was the genius of it. The old man had spent 46 years being so completely ordinary, so perfectly forgettable, that they had no way of knowing what an extraordinary man might have done with all that time. "You're lying," the second man said, but he said it a half-second too late. "Maybe," Walter said. "You're welcome to find out. Burn the shop down, make me an accident, and in 3 days every name in that box is on the front page of 3 newspapers, and the men who are still alive, the men who gave you your orders, the men whose careers were built on the bodies my friends became, get to spend their final years explaining themselves under oath." He smiled again, gently now, almost kindly. "I'm 81. I've already buried everyone I ever loved. You're threatening a man with nothing left to lose. That's not a threat. That's a gift." What happened next, Eli could not have predicted. The first man's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, and stepped to the corner of the shop, turning his back. He spoke in a low voice for almost a full minute. Eli caught only fragments. "Confirmed. The boy too. No, he's not authorizing that. Understood." And when he turned around, the warmth had gone out of his face entirely and been replaced by something more careful, something that looked almost like respect. "It seems," the first man said slowly, "that you're not the only one who made arrangements." He looked at the second man, and an entire conversation passed between them in a single glance. "There are people above us who would very much prefer that whatever you've sealed stays sealed, permanently, for everyone's sake, including theirs." "I imagined there might be," Walter said. And then a third figure came through the door. He was old, nearly as old as Walter, and he walked with a cane, and he wore a veteran's cap over white hair, and when he stepped into the shop, the 2 younger men straightened in a way that told Eli everything about who held the real authority in the room. The old man with the cane stopped just inside the door and looked at Walter Henning for a long, long time, and his eyes were wet. "My God," he said, "it really is you. They told me you died in Baltimore. I read the report. I helped write the cover. I've spent 46 years thinking I signed off on burning a friend." His voice broke. "Crowbar. They used to call you Crowbar because there wasn't a thing made you couldn't pry open." Walter's composure cracked for the first time. "Hello, Sam." "You magnificent ghost," the old man whispered. And then slowly, painfully, leaning on his cane, he did something that made the 2 younger agents go rigid and made Eli's eyes sting. He drew himself up as straight as his ruined back would allow, and he raised his free hand to the brim of his cap, and he held it there. A salute to a man who had officially been dead for 46 years, to a man whose name had been a corpse's name, to a man who had spent 46 years cutting keys in a town nobody could find, guarding a box no one was supposed to remember. "I came the second I heard the file got pulled," Sam said, lowering his hand. "I'm retired now, but I've still got enough friends in enough rooms to make noise. These 2 were sent to close it. I came to make sure they couldn't." He looked at the agents. "It's over. The order's rescinded. Higher than you, higher than me. Nobody wants what's in that box getting aired, and the only way it stays buried is if he stays alive and comfortable and very, very well left alone." He turned back to Walter, and his old face crumpled into something like joy and grief at once. "You won, Crowbar. 46 years late, But you won. You outlasted every one of the bastards." The two younger agents left without another word. The locked door closed behind them, and the old man named Sam crossed the little shop and embraced the man who had been Walter Henning, and the two of them stood there among the brass shavings and the hanging keys, two ghosts holding onto each other, while a 23-year-old apprentice watched and understood that he had spent 6 weeks learning to cut keys from one of the most extraordinary men who had ever lived. There was a great deal more, of course. There always is. Sam stayed 3 days. He and Walter sat in the back of the shop until late each night, and Eli, who had been told he was free to go and had refused to leave, brought them coffee and listened to two old men resurrect a world that had been buried under cover stories and warehouse fires. He learned the names of the 6 men who could open anything. He learned which of their deaths in the newspapers had been real and which had been arranged. He learned that the box held proof of 11 operations that the public had been told failed, that had in fact succeeded, and 4 that the public had been told succeeded, that had in fact been disasters paid for in lives that were written up as traffic accidents and drownings and unfortunate hearts that simply stopped. And he learned why Walter had kept the box instead of using it. "Because the moment I opened it to the world," the old man said, "I'd have killed the men still doing the work. The ones like me, the ones still out there in the cold. The secret protected guilty men, yes, but it also protected innocent ones. So I held it. I held it for 46 years, as a threat and a shield both, and I prayed I'd die before I ever had to choose." He looked at his hands. "I'm tired, Eli. I've been tired since before your mother was born. Walter Henning did not become famous. That was never the point, and it was never going to happen. The box stayed sealed, the arrangement held, and the men in the high rooms kept their secrets in exchange for letting an old locksmith live out his days in peace. But something changed in Marrow Creek all the same, in the small way that real things change. Sam came back to visit twice a year until his death, and on each visit he and Walter sat in the front window of the shop in plain view, 2 old men playing chess, and people walking past would wave, and Walter would lift a hand, and nobody but Eli ever knew that they were watching a kind of monument. Eli stayed. He had come for the money and stayed for the hands, and now he stayed for the man. Walter taught him everything, not just the locks, but the watching, the stillness, the way to read a room and a person and a lie. "You have the gift," the old man told him once. "I knew it the first week. The way you couldn't leave my silence alone. That's not nosiness, son. That's the thing that made me what I was. The world is full of locked doors, and most people are content to walk past them. You're not. Just remember, every door you open you become responsible for what's behind it." Walter Henning died on a Tuesday in the spring, at 84, in the back room of his shop, in his chair, with a half-cut key in his hand. Eli found him in the morning. The old man looked in death exactly as peaceful as he had ever managed to look in life, more maybe. And around his neck, on its chain, against his still chest, was the small grey key he had worn every day for 49 years. Eli buried him under the name Walter Henning, because that was the name the town knew, and because the man who had earned a different name had spent his whole life making sure no one would ever read it. But he had the stone cut with 1 extra line beneath the dates, a line that meant nothing to anyone in Marrow Creek and everything to the 2 old men who would have understood it. It read, "He opened every door but one, and that one he guarded." The box went to Sam's family, sealed, with the arrangement intact, the dam still holding. The key Eli kept. He wears it now on a chain against his own chest, the way the old man wore it, and he runs the shop on Delano Street, and he sweeps the floor in long straight strokes, never circular, and he sits with his back to the wall and watches the bell over the door. People in Marrow Creek say the new locksmith is a little strange, a little too quiet, a little too quick to notice things. They say he can open any lock in the world. They don't know the half of it. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the shop is empty and the keys hang glinting on the walls like 1,000 small answers to 1,000 small questions, Eli takes out the grey key and holds it in his palm and thinks about the man who taught him that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a locked door. It's a man who has spent his whole life learning to wait. Because here is the thing about secrets, the thing Walter Henning knew, and the thing Eli came to understand. A secret kept long enough stops being a burden and becomes a kind of monument. It marks the place where someone chose, every single day for 46 years, to carry a thing alone rather than set it down on the innocent. The world is full of locked boxes. Most of them, if we're lucky, will never be opened. And somewhere out there right now, there are old men and old women who look perfectly ordinary, who cut keys and tune pianos and tend gardens and repair watches, and who carry against their quiet hearts the proof of things the rest of us were never meant to know. The question is not whether they exist. The question is what we would owe them if we ever found out.